Just a little note about today's episode. Toward the latter part of the episode, our Zoom call failed, and so you'll notice a little bit of a audio change while I called our guest on the phone and conducted the rest of the interview there. So just bear with the audio quality and enjoy.
I sat there and I looked at the goats and I said, hey, this camera will shoot video. And I thought, huh.
Welcome to Hamdom Thoughts, a podcast about ham radio, electronics, software, and tinkering. I'm your host, Dennis, FCC licensed amateur radio operator, call sign 86DM. Today I'm honored to have Steve, WG0AT, on the show. Steve takes the idea of SOTA mountain goat to a whole new level, especially since his hikes often involve actual goats. Steve is an active used to be an active search and rescue volunteer, and is an inspiration to hams all over the world with his operating activity and keen handcrafted radio gear. Let's talk with Steve today on episode 17. Stay tuned. Hey, Steve. Thank you so much for taking time today to be on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great and happy to be here.
Yeah, it's such a cold morning. We're recording this on a Sunday, and I know that here in California, cold is a very subjective term compared to where you're at. You're in Colorado, right?
That's right. And it was about 24 when I woke up this morning and stoked the wood stove and made my first cup of coffee. But it's in the mid 40s right now.
Oh boy.
And sunny.
Yeah. How cold does it get in the evenings?
When that sun goes down, you can feel it. It drops maybe 10 degrees when that sun goes over the horizon.
So it's freezing out there.
Have to have the tank heaters and the goat's water and the horse's water to keep it from freezing. So they've got drinking water all the time.
Oh yeah, things to think about when everything's frozen.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Steve, you're one of the most active SOTA hams that I know of. I mean, I get alerts for you quite a bit. Both SOTA activators and chasers are quite honestly in awe of you. They revere you, and they always are excited when you're on the air. They want to seek contact from you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got started in ham radio?
Yeah, well, first let me say that the whole concept of that revere and admire is I'm honored by that. And when I get to the top of a peak, I feel it's my joy to hand out points to all these folks who have pulled me out of the noise and listened for me and followed me around, as I hop from band to band. It's a joy to have all these signals pour in and to be able to respond back to them, and almost on a first name basis. I mean, it seems like, I made a cheat sheet that has calls and names, so I can respond, appropriately. And sometimes it's have brain fade and have to say, thank you, OM, because I can't remember the guy's name.
You know the call, but you can't remember the name. That's happened to me a couple times.
Exactly. So let's see. I grew up in the Los Angeles basin, Southern California, quite a few years ago. And what started me out, just tickling my interest in radio waves, was I built a crystal set my brother got for me for a birthday and helped me build it. And later I discovered that on the broadcast radio that was in my dad's car, you could tune down below the broadcast band and you'd hear these, I guess they're called airport navigation beacons.
Oh, yeah.
And they were sending Morse code real slowly, like Los Angeles would be da did did da da did da. In other words, LAX.
Ah, okay.
And I thought, wow, what is this? And so I went to the library and got a book, looked up a Morse code table, and saw it was all broken down, and I copied that. And in grade school, I gave my buddy a copy of the table, the Morse code table, and we would sit in the back of the class and wink back and forth in Morse code and send secret messages back and forth.
That's brilliant. That is brilliant.
Until we got caught. And then the teacher made us come up in front of the class and explain all about the Morse code and what we were doing with it, et cetera. And it wasn't long after that a lot of kids in the class were winking back and forth at each other to the teacher's dismay.
You started a movement.
Yeah. So it was that sort of got me interested in the code, and then I also just radio waves in general, and then it all led to eventually getting my ham license and passed my novice test. And my call sign for my novice in the mid '50s was WV6HXL, and in Morse code.
Oh, that's pretty complicated in Morse code. Yes.
Yeah, they're all 4 characters, all 4 units long in terms of each character. I mean, when I called CQ and then they gave my call sign, the other person would probably fall over asleep, just waiting for me to send K. In other words, go ahead.
Or send a question mark. There's a lot of combinations in those.
So yeah, that was pre-college. Actually, it was pre-surfing, and I got involved in surfing while in high school, and spending a lot of time cutting class.
Oh boy!
And heading to the beach just because it was outdoors and it was sunshine, salt water, and a lot of eye candy. And
yeah. So you were drawn to the outdoors even at an early age.
Yeah. It was, and I wasn't very good at surfing, but I discovered that I like watching it. And so I got a camera and a telephoto lens and started becoming a surf photographer. And I met more girls on the beach than I did in the water. So it was productive in that sense. And then later on, wound up during the Vietnam era, I volunteered for the draft, and luck of the draw, I wound up in Germany for 2 years, learning how to drink beer.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And it was after that, when I came back, that I sort of figured out, okay, I better, figure out where I'm going and how I'm going to get there. And wound up in art school, and which is, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the sciences, obviously, electronics in particular. But it was shortly after I got married and moved to Colorado. And Colorado was the high point on our honeymoon when we went back to New York to visit some relatives. I kept thinking about our journey through, the Rockies, and it was just hard not to come back to that location, and gotten involved in backpacking and, doing the outdoor thing. And then I joined search and rescue. Initially, not so much because of the aspect of what they were doing, but more from the standpoint that I went to a local ham club meeting, and it seems like all the hams were sitting around the coffee pot, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, eating donuts, and complaining about their ailments. And I said, wow, this is not my cup of tea. And my photographer friend, who was doing work for us through the company, HP, said, hey, why don't you come on down to a SAR meeting? We need radio operators, or people that are savvy about radios. And so I got involved in the communication side of search and rescue. And to be a member, you had to go through a whole training process so that you didn't become a victim when you're out on a mission.
So this was back in the 70s, you said, that you were training to be in search and rescue? Uh-huh.
So it was that whole experience just really developed my outdoor confidence, and not only from being prepared kind of aspect, and being in condition where you can help haul some gear to the backcountry. We had litter frames, ropes, oxygen bottles, besides what you were hauling on your own back, which you had to have at least be able to survive 3 days out if you accidentally got left in the backcountry for some reason. But it was an interesting experience, and from the standpoint that when you did find the lost victim or the injured person, oftentimes you had an opportunity to spend time with them and talk to them, and interview them like we're doing here, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gave me a lot of insight as to how did they get in that situation, and how could they have, what would have been the one thing that they would have put in their pack besides extra clothing, water, and that whole list of 10 essentials, which I can't recite off the top of my head, but you can Google it. And when you head for the backcountry, those 10 essentials are the checklist that you look at seriously before jumping out of the car and going for a short hike in the woods with your flip-flops and no water bottle except your fob for your automobile.
Yeah.
So I was attracted to QRP, I think, from the standpoint that it's similar in a lot of respects to a lot of different hobbies and pursuits. The one area that seems to be, from my experience, closest to it was fly fishing, and where you tie your own flies to replicate another insect that exists in the wild. Matter of fact, my mentor used to get down on his hands and knees and crawl around the edge of the stream looking for dead bugs to see what was hatching.
Interesting.
And then he would open his fly kit and tie a fly that emulated or looked like a stonefly or a grasshopper or a flying ant.
Mm.
And then tie that onto his tip of his fly line and look around, reading the water, so to speak, trying to catch a fish, and present the fly to him on a cast. QRP is like that in a lot of respects. You build the radio, and by reading the band conditions, figure out where the signals are going to be, and then you make a catch. And your signal may not be booming in on both sides, in some cases, if the other station is running power and you're running low power, it's a challenge. And
Yeah.
I think the other station is actually probably doing more work than you are,
Yeah.
although it's taken a lot of energy on your part just to figure out how you can talk to this other station.
Yeah. That's a really great analogy. I've never really thought of it in terms of just fly fishing is definitely you're assessing the environment and coming up with the most specialized way to work within that environment. And that has a lot of great parallels to activating a mountain in summits on the air.
Most definitely. Yeah. My enjoyment of building tiny QRP kits and then using them outdoors and mountain topping, I did a lot of that even before Summits on the Air came to North America, which was about 10, 12 years ago. But what I liked about it, it was like having to earn your contacts or earn your QSOs, as opposed to just flipping on the radio and in the comfort of your study or your basement, blasting 200 watts across the pond and making a contact with, a lot of hardware and metal in the sky. And it was like my mentor in fly fishing who crawled around on his hands and knees and found an insect that had washed up on the sand and said, this is what they're feeding on.
Yeah. So you're well known for your goats. Can you tell us a little bit about your goats?
Yeah. So I was fly fishing one day. I was getting ready to retire, and I went up to a local reservoir, the headwaters of the local reservoir, and on my back cast, and you cast your line around a lot in fly fishing because you're basically bouncing this little tiny, maybe a gram in terms of weight off the water, hoping that a fly or a fish sees it and nails it. So you're whipping your fly rod around with this lightweight line on it, trying to cast that fly into the right spot before you saw the last rise, hoping that that's where the fish is. And on the back cast, I lift a guy's hat off his head who was downstream of me.
Oh boy.
And I said, oops. And that's when I started thinking about the population and the popularity of fishing, that going someplace where it was less crowded and potentially no one except you and the bears and the wildlife. And that's when I started reading a book about fly fishing high altitude alpine lakes, and the strategy and doing it when the ice is just coming off. Fish are really hungry, haven't eaten for a long time, or eaten insects anyway for a long time. Halfway through the book, he talks about his hiking partner who's carrying all his gear. It's a goat.
Okay.
And I go, wow, a goat. And we were living here where we've lived the last 20 years, which is on 10 acres at the foot of Mount Herman. And my wife's into horses, and I thought, yeah, I could have goats. And so that's what got me started. And I started researching pack goats. And here, just in North America, there's about 700 members of National Association of Pack Goats. And they're very active social media group. And, I just started reading all I could and finding out about goats. I mean, I was the original city slicker. And when we moved to Colorado, it was like, what am I going to do with a surfboard? Yeah. And traded that in for hiking boots and backpacking gear, and which is all well and good, but I was getting to a point where, putting 50, 60 pounds on my back was not fun. It definitely took the spring out of my step, and went through that whole ultralight phase and lightening my pack down to but also it was lightening my wallet at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then we got, like I was telling you earlier before we started the recording, that I was out on a local mountain. This was back before Summits on the Air came to North America. And I had a little QRP rig that I had built, and, was all excited to launch a signal with it and see how many contacts I could get. And back in those days, there was no website where you would be spotted. So your friends, QRP buddies, didn't necessarily know that you were going to be on the air, other than there was, and still is, a QRPL discussion group or list that you can sign on for, and it distributes, email discussion, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I could go on there. As a matter of fact, I did a couple of times go on there and post that I was, hey, I was going to head out Sunday morning, and I'd be on this mountain, kind of between this time window if anybody's around. Because you could sit and call CQ for what seemed like ever and may not get a contact.
Yeah.
And that led me into using sideband, and because it seemed like there was always somebody, a couple of duffers sitting around on 20 meters or 40 meters, just talking about the weather or their latest operation or, whatever. But that was that day that I went up with the goats. It was windy. My antenna blew over the mast that I had my wire on, blew over and broke. And I forget what it was. Something else broke on the radio. Maybe it was my headphone plug. So, they were all showstoppers.
Wow. A lot of failures.
Yeah. And I felt, I just felt like, hey, this was kind of a bummer. And it was windy and it was cold, and the goats were with me. And I had this digital camera that took great pictures in terms of, scenic shots, that kind of thing. And plus, it was when digital cameras were kind of just, I think, coming in, but it shot video. And I thought, And this is when the Survivor Man series I was watching on television.
Oh yeah, Survivor Man. I love that show.
Yeah, and what's really I have to admire is that Les produced that himself, basically. I mean,
yeah,
sure, he probably hired later on some high-end editors to juice it up with effects and music and all that. But the point was that he shot it himself. He was a cameraman. He was director, producer. It was, and it was good stuff. Anyway, that inspired me to try and shoot some video. And so I using that camera that day, the rest of our hike, which was a descent, because from there it was all downhill, so to speak. I had about 15 minutes of video, and went back through and looked at it and boiled it down to about 5 minutes of video, of usable video, watchable, as I call watchable video. And produced my first little video, which I put up on YouTube, and then I sent a link out to my friends on QRPL discussion group, and I got a lot of positive feedback, and so it inspired me to continue that direction with the goats, and eventually I put kind of gave them, well, I didn't give them personalities, they had personalities. And I just amplified that by doing word balloons or thought balloons over their heads, using special effects, and so that they were basically joined the conversation and were saying things behind my back, like, oh, the old man's going to make us carry a bunch of crap today. Or, yeah, I think, Peanut, you've got more in your pack than I've got in mine, or vice versa.
What are your goats' names?
Peanut and Rooster.
Peanut and Rooster. Mm-hmm.
And Rooster was a goat, a dairy goat, but a boy goat. So the dairies, unless you're productive in some way, shape, or form, the boy goats don't last long in a dairy farm, mm-hmm. and get put up for auction, and that's where I found Rooster. And they're also pretty proud of their pedigrees and names. His original name was, gotta love him, Rooster Cogburn.
Oh, wow. That's quite a name.
Yeah. And that's kind of a John Wayne had that name in it for, I'm not sure what, but a sign just flashed up here. It says my internet connection is unstable. I hope.
Yeah, you're still fine.
Okay.
There's a little bit of a blip there earlier, but you're fine.
Okay. So yeah, Rooster was my big goat. He weighed 225 pounds, and Peanut. And you can't just get one goat. They're social animals in the sense, mm-hmm. That they're herd animals, and they like to have a buddy to hang out with. Otherwise, they get neurotic like humans. Mm-hmm. And Peanut came from a commune, a group of dropout 60s hippies that were raising goats. Matter of fact, he came from a herd of 35 goats, and they were raising him as a meat goat. Oh. And technically, he didn't have a name, because you don't give a name to an animal that you're going to sit down and have for dinner.
Yeah.
So, but he was such a runt, skinny little, weighed about 35, 40 pounds. And eventually he blossomed into a 160-pound goat. And
wow.
He was more cerebral from the standpoint that he was more withdrawn, whereas Rooster was just in your face.
These weights that you're talking about, like 225 pounds for Rooster, and 100. I always imagined goats to be pretty light, like almost like a dog, but that's pretty heavy. 225 pounds is
yeah, but heavy. It was mostly muscle, surprisingly, and thus, like a human, you could put 25% of their body weight. In other words, I could put 50, 60 pounds on Rooster, and he would just look at me like, yeah, what?
Wow, that's great.
But I loaded them maybe 10, 15% of their weight, unless I was going someplace where, a stretch of miles, a stretch of days that we were going to not be near water, and they would wind up being the water caddy.
And so they're pretty self-sufficient, but also they don't go wandering off or take off in some direction. They'll just follow wherever you go.
They're herd animals. And once you establish yourself as the alpha, they'll follow you everywhere. I mean, when I was out overnighting and would head off into the woods to take care of business, turn around, and here's my two buddies just, following me.
Just watching you.
And watching me. So I had to used to always having company.
Yeah.
They're great companions on the trail, because they just nibble, they trim the trail, so to speak.
Yeah.
and I would usually carry some kind of snack in my pocket, because when you call them, if you can reward them for coming, it really helped. And I didn't always reward them, but occasionally when they were tempted by either some green grass or something, and I wanted to get going, I'd call them, and if they came, I would reward them, and then we would head off and leave that patch of green grass or whatever it was that they were attracted to behind.
Yeah. You mentioned briefly earlier about bears and wildlife. Ever encounter any close calls or any incidents with wildlife while you're out there with your goats?
Yeah, actually 2 times. The first time was a bear, and it was the middle of the night, and I had prior to the goats, I hadn't been that cautious of where I ate and what I whether I hung my food or not. But with the goats, I became a lot more aware of the whole food thing. And I prepped my dinner, and dinner was like a freeze dried meal that I just boiled water for. But I got lazy that night, and after I ate, and just decided, oh man, I'm going to hit the sack. And where I prepared the food was probably 50 yards from where my tent was, and I just sort of left everything. Can't remember if I cleaned out the trash or what, but later that evening, middle of the night, all of a sudden I hear my mess kit, being shuffled around, and popped on the flashlight, unzipped my tent. And by the way, the goats sleep outside the tent. And when I shined the flashlight, I could see these eyes looking back at me. And that's when I reached in, and I forget what I had inside. Anyway, I started clanging a couple objects together and making loud noises like, get the heck out of here. And sure enough, the bear just turned around, and, I shined the flashlight again, and all I could see was this tail of a big black furry bear just shooting through the bushes.
Wow.
Thankfully. And I looked over at the goats, and they were plastered up against the side of my tent. Like, what are you going to do now, Dad?
They didn't make any noises. They were just scared.
Yeah, they were totally quiet. They made no noise, nothing that would get the bear's attention. But I'm sure the bear could probably smell them, just because they have, if they could smell bacon at 6 miles, they could probably smell a goat at 50 yards. So the other experience was a mountain lion, and that was later on. Another overnighter, and I woke up in the middle of the night to this blood curdling howl, and it was a mountain lion, and he was probably 30 yards out from the tent, I'm guessing. Well, I confirmed that the next morning by looking at his tracks around the tent, and he was trying to get the goats to run, because then the game is on. Typically, a mountain lion does not attack a dead object. They're in it for the sport, and chasing down their prey, and then killing it and devouring it. But I got out of the tent, zipped it up, and started making noises and throwing rocks and anything I could in the direction, making loud noises. And I stood around for probably a half hour before going back in the tent, and I heard nothing. And then pretended to sleep the rest of the night with both ears open.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Later, I talked with a ranger, and he said, "Yeah, that's their MO. Is they'll try and spook their prey into running. Since the goats were not spooking, he went elsewhere for his dinner."
So let me switch gears here and ask you about Summits on the Air in particular. How did you get started in it?
Well, like I was mentioning earlier, I did solo field days on the mountaintop, since I live right here at the base of Mount Herman, and it takes me about 15 minutes to get from my house to the trailhead, and then another maybe 45 minutes to an hour to get to the summit. It's a great place to launch RF from. And when I was starting to do videos, or was doing a lot of videos actually on a regular basis, that a friend of mine in Canada, WG0AT, Jean-Pierre, he was also producing videos, and we kind of played off each other in terms of stealing each other's cool technique or effect or whatever, or sometimes soundtracks. Anyway, he said, "Hey, you ought to get into this Summits on the Air thing." He was doing it. For some reason, it came to the New England, Canadian area before it really filtered out through and ran across the U.S. in terms of hitting the West Coast. But he told me, he said, "Hey, you really ought to sign up for the SOTA thing and start doing it." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, you get on the air and you make contacts and then turn your logs in, and you get points for it, and then, it's a fun game." And I said, "Oh man, it just sounds like a lot of paperwork." And I'm having fun as it is, and I don't need to track this thing and then upload logs and keep track of points, and it would just subtract the fun of it. And my ham buddies, I was also doing many de-expeditions to the Caribbean with the buddy pole guys, and there I experienced pileups and the whole logging process, and realized that maybe this would be kind of fun. Maybe this would be kind of fun to track points and visit different peaks instead of always going to the same peak. And so I signed up for it. I signed up to be the regional manager for the W0 district. And that ensued a lot of emails and communication about, why some summits were qualified and some summits weren't qualified. And so the administration of that, I didn't particularly care for, and I handed that off to another upcoming SOTA goat, so to speak, and got back to my true love of just being out there on the trail and making and refining my gear, so to speak. Mm-hmm. There's a delicate balance between being prepared and having the right stuff versus having a pack that is overstuffed.
Yeah. I think I fall in that latter category far too much. End up bringing things that I really don't use or wouldn't need in that particular situation.
Yeah. It's and it seems like each time I go out, I realize there's another thing I should have brought.
Yeah.
Case in point, this last activation I did when my hiking buddy, SOTA buddy, Steve, K7PX, got to the top of the mountain and in the activation zone, and found a place where I could sit up, got my telescopic pole out and pushed it up, got the antenna up and leaned the pole against this smaller tree and fastened it so it wouldn't fall over, and then stretched out the wire and ran back to my radio and fired the radio up. And I didn't hear a lot of band noise. And I thought, well, maybe the band's dead. So I spotted myself and started calling CQ. And usually I met with a wall of sound. Matter of fact, it sort of sounds like, I'll play you some of it. It sounds like this. So it's a wall of sound that comes at you. And when I didn't hear that wall of sound, I thought, wow, something's wrong. And I jumped up and ran over to the antenna and checked all the connections on it. And the antenna happened to be a switched end-fed half wave. Mm-hmm. I had links in it for 20, 30, 40. Mm-hmm. And I checked the links and everything, and I said, yeah, that's they're all correct. And so I went back and I said, well, let me try a different band. So I went to 20 meters, and I could, usually you can tune up to the digital area where all the guys are doing FT8 and PSK, et cetera. And that is usually a good indicator if the band's open or not. If you hear signals, then the band's open.
Yeah.
If you don't hear signals, I mean, forget it. So I dropped back down to my frequency of choice and started CQing again. And I must have CQ'd for about 5 minutes and nothing, silence. And that's when I opened up my little radio, and immediately when I hinged back the cover and looked inside, here's this red wire sticking me in the nose practically. It's the antenna wire. It came unsoldered from the PC board.
Oh boy.
And so there's always stuff that's happening. SOTA is an adventure, it's never the same twice. And if I had had a solder iron.
I think I know what you're talking about. You posted on Twitter about this, right? You had a lighter.
Yeah.
You're holding a lighter up to your case there, your radio.
Yeah.
And the flame, you're trying to solder it back, huh?
Yeah, I was thinking I could, very carefully get the tip of the flame where it needed to go, but Mother Nature was also kicking up about a 10-knot breeze, and then Steve came over and tried to block it for me, and it was solder was getting greasy, looking like it's melting. That's my fingers just, I can't hold this anymore. And the insulation was dripping off the wire, and I said,
"Oh wow,
this isn't going to work." But that's when Steve stood up and says, "Hey, well, you just use my radio."
Yeah, and
he's got a little MTR3 and halfway that he made that's very much, well, it's he watched Adam's video on building the half-wave transformer,
mm-hmm.
and also on making trap. He's got a nice, anyway.
All right, Steve, I don't know if you can hear me, but you just froze up. Well, this is unusual. For the first time, we've actually lost our Zoom connection during an interview. So I'm going to have to see if we could get Steve back on.
There you are.
Hello.
Hey, Dennis, how you doing?
Pretty good. So I actually lost your connection there. So just trying the phone here, see if it sounds any better. But that's a first. I've never had a Zoom failure in a in an interview. So you were talking a bit about your Summits on the Air experiences.
Yeah, and so it's always an adventure. I love in the military. I was in the artillery, and we used maps a lot, and had to plot where the forward observer was to make sure we didn't blow him up, and also where that he would call in our targets. And so I was on the charts with maps a lot. That was my job, a chart operator. And we would calculate the deflection and elevation for the artillery guns, and so that skill set sort of blends into what I'm doing now in terms of SOTA. You're looking at maps, you're looking at where the summit is, you're trying to read the maps and figure out, okay, what's the best route? Is there any intel on the web about the trail, other people? And that's the thing about here in Colorado, it seems like a lot of the peaks have already been climbed. A lot of folks put their trip reports on the web, so there's a lot of information about how to access the summit, some of which is sketchy, some of which is over-exaggerated, some of which is pretty accurate. So there's the route finding aspect of it. There's the planning ahead, bringing the right gear, the weather, the elements of nature, what kind of barriers is she going to throw in front of you? And there's the whole radio thing, the propagation, bringing what gear do you think? Oh, there's going to be a contest this weekend. Well, we better stay away from sideband. Or there's a CW contest. Well, maybe it's an opportunity to bring a microphone with. The whole gear thing in terms of refining the gear, and I got into making paddles with using beryllium finger stock that's used on the back of computer back planes in the doors to seal up the door, RF-wise, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I found this elk vertebrae on the trail one day as we were, well, actually wasn't on the trail, we were bushwhacking up the side of this mountain and came on a carcass that had, basically bleached bones. And so I grabbed this elk vertebrae and I said, I could make a paddle out of this. And so I did. I used a couple of brass carpet tacks for the eyes because I wanted to make it look like a mountain goat. And I found a touch keyer circuit board on the web that I sent off for, and it came and wired it up and attached it to the eyes. And so when your thumb touches one brass eye, it's a dit, and your pointer finger touches the other brass eye, it's a da. And basically, it was an electronic capacitive switch. So that became my paddle, and then I decorated it with some elk hair, and it does look like a mountain goat.
That is really cool. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because you said early on that, you started in an art major and were really, really drawn to the outdoors and got into ham radio. But where does this engineering skill come from? I mean, you're very productive and creative with the things that you're putting together. I was just curious, how did you get to this point where you're building radios and fashioning CW keys out of found objects?
Actually, I had in one of my art classes, we had to create kinetic sculpture, and I was fascinated with these little LED lights. I think it was pre-LED. Yeah, it had to be. Anyway, I created this revolving, using a slow motor, again, just hacking stuff together. I created this light sculpture that was unpredictable. And it was because it was this like a revolving Christmas tree, but at such a speed that I had light bulbs, tiny little light bulbs on the end of flimsy pieces of wire that were hurling around, and actually the whole thing self-destructed and burned up, but that's another story. Anyway, it was kind of my introduction into creating something out of nothing, and it required understanding, basic electronics and hooking things together so that they wouldn't short out. And in that, plus 30 some years of working with engineers. And when I had a little QRP rig that I had built up and it wasn't working, I'd march into the lab at work and find my buddy who was good at troubleshooting and say, "Hey, Jack, can I buy you lunch? I got this radio, it doesn't work." He'd swipe clean his bench and pull up the probes from his oscilloscope and start poking through my radio. Next thing we know, he'd say, "There's your problem. There's a cold solder joint."
Mm.
So it was a fun journey. And it seems much more valuable or much more meaningful to me if I'm using something that I've built myself with my own two hands. It's the contacts are sweeter.
Yeah, I can imagine.
As opposed, anybody can, buy a radio off the shelf and make contacts and say, "Hey, that's pretty cool. It's fun." but I equate it to the fly fishing analogy that I mentioned earlier. Or have you ever rubbed two sticks together to start a fire?
I have actually never tried making a fire that way.
Well, I got interested in it with it in all these survival shows, and so I built a bow drill, and watched some videos on YouTube, and also read about it on the web, and the different materials that are required, and I made fire, and it was so cool. I mean, afterwards I just got goosebumps that I built fire from rubbing a couple of pieces of wood together. It was more involved in that, and you had to understand what was going on in terms of, you didn't actually make fire, you made an ember, and you put that ember in a little bird nest of dry weeds, and blew on it, and it got bigger and got hotter, and it started the weeds on fire, and this progression from the ember to actually burning logs.
Yeah. So is there anything that you're building right now? Any projects that you're working on?
Well, actually right now I'm hacking together a little cigarette lighter solder iron.
Yeah.
That I saw something on the web. Actually, Stuart, KB1 HQS, replied to my post on Twitter with a picture from, I think it was called hackaday.org or whatever, that somebody had put together using a Bic cigarette lighter and made a little coil out of copper wire, and then when you turn it on, the coil heats up, and it heats up hot enough that you could solder with the tip of it.
Yeah, I saw that.
Cool idea.
That response as well, and I think I want to try to make one of those too. Just have a field soldering iron ready in the pack.
Exactly.
That's really cool. Any rigs or any antennas or rigs that you're building right now?
Well, and I am, now that the bands are heating up, I'm getting excited about 17 meters, 15 meters, 12 meters, 10 meters, 6 meters. And I do have a little mountaintop rig that does 5 bands up through 15 meters. And I currently have just an end-fed half wave that's got traps in it for 40, 30, and 20. And so I want to put some more traps in it for the other bands. But then I started thinking about, wait a minute, a trap basically decouples the rest of the wire. So I've got 60 feet of wire up here. Actually, it's 58 something. And I'm decoupling over 2/3 of it so I can get on 15 meters. Why bother with the rest of that wire? Why not just put up a 12-foot piece of wire and be done with it? Or is there some way I could make that whole big chunk of wire resonant on the higher bands and be useful? In other words, I always was under the impression of bigger, higher, and more wire was better than less. And so right now I'm investigating, at least on the theory side, what happens when you end feed a random long wire in terms of gain and pattern, and maybe actually do some backyard experiments with that in terms of reverse beacon, where you can get some scientific measurements of, is the thing putting out, is it not? So that's kind of one project I'm working on. But radio-wise, I'm happy with the KX2. I'm happy with my little homebrew or kit-built radios. I've repackaged some of them so that they're lighter weight and they're smaller, and I can do quick day hikes up Mount Hermon with them and not even know that I've got a battery and a radio in my back pocket. But I don't know. It's one of the things that I've discovered when you go to a popular summit where there's tourists and other hikers hiking around, that those folks are up there for mostly the challenge of it, or the, seeking the views, taking photographs and that sort of thing. And here's this guy that's over in the corner beeping away on Morse code, and he's got an antenna or a piece of wire, laying over a bush, or he's got a mag loop or a vertical. What the heck is that? What is he up to? And so I put together a little postcard that I printed up locally that explains the headline at the top of it. Says, "So what am I doing?" And it explains that I'm a ham radio operator, and my passion is hiking and playing radio on top of mountains, and that I'm licensed by the FCC, and oh, by the way, I volunteer for emergency communication services when all else fails. And so that, it kind of explains why I'm there and what I'm doing. And it's a lot like geocaching, but with radio signals, radio waves. And that there's a whole universe of hams out there that I'm making contact with.
Yeah.
And so it breaks the ice as to, what I'm up to. And actually, you become a ham radio ambassador at that point. I one day was on a 14er, and here comes a family of 4, a little girl and a boy that was about 10, and mom and dad. And we were standing up, operating. I had my paddle on my thigh, and I was, sending Morse code, and you could hear it because it was on speaker. And I looked over, and I could see the boy pointing at me, and he was tugging on his dad, saying, "Dad, what's he doing?" And he said, I heard his dad overheard his dad say, "Well, I don't know, but let's go find out." And so they came over, and I, actually was my other hiking partner who explained to him what I was doing. I was talking to a guy in France, and wow. He said the guy in France is sending Morse code right now, saying his name is Pierre, and that he's just outside Paris. And God, the kid's eyes just got big, glassed over, like, wow, holy crap. And so it became an opportunity to, be a ambassador for ham radio. And, who knows, my friend had one of these brochures, like from the ERL, that says, "And now you're talking." There's the title on it, and it explained all about ham radio. And you can get a license and join a club and all this, that, and the other. And as the kid dove into the brochure, the dad looked at us and nodded his head like, "Yeah, man, thank you."
Thanks. What have you gotten me into?
Yeah. Who knows? That kid might be the next, Einstein.
Yeah.
So it's a fun, healthy radio sport. I mean, you don't need a membership to a gym club to stay fit. Hiking does that for you.
Yeah.
Without you knowing it or feeling it.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, any other advice that you have for people?
Well, I don't know. It seems anything I've done, I've kind of pushed the envelope. I mean, I had a buddy who back in college said we'd go out and drink beer and whatnot, and he'd say, "Man, if you got into drinking tequila, you'd probably eat the worm." And he said, "Well, I don't know about that, but it's, as far as ham radio is concerned, I would say getting outdoors with ham radio, whether it's Parks on the Air, Summits on the Air, or a field day. It really makes you a better operator from the standpoint of having to think ahead and get your gear prepped for taking it to the park or field day or whatever. And I would recommend setting it up in the backyard, making sure you've got all the cables, all the adapters, and then get on the air from your backyard. Make a couple of contacts. Then you know that you've got everything working, and chances are it'll work when you get to the top of the mountain or that park bench that you're headed for.
Yeah.
Just the challenge of making contacts, looking at the propagation, looking at and thinking, keeping a positive attitude, thinking, hey, somebody out there is going to hear me, and I will make, the required number of QSOs to qualify for the points or whatever game it is that you're playing. But
yeah.
And find the fun in it for you, be it making the gear your own or learning about antennas and or propagation, and learning about the geography of, places you're talking to. And that's the cool thing about this hobby. It's unlike stamp collecting or coin collecting. There's a lot of history in those hobbies, but the stamps don't talk to you. You're contacting another human being on the other side of the planet and then making a friend.
Yeah.
And there's that QSL card that comes back from them, maybe if you've sent him one, that, kind of brings up the memory of the contact and that day and where were you.
Yeah.
So it's a really cool hobby. I mean, it's I've learned a lot. It's enriched my life in ways that I can't even begin to explain.
Yeah, and you've even said yourself that in the very beginning of this interview that you feel great giving out those points as well. So other people out there who are on the other end trying to chase you, they're also getting to enjoy this hobby and feeling excited about ham radio just by being able to reach out and try to get that QSO with you.
Yeah, it's sharing the joy and sharing the fact that, hey, you can hear me and I can hear you. Yeah. And it's by some effort that we put forth to make it happen, as opposed to, I was on Mount Hermon one day and I was up there, banging away on Morse code, and this hiker walks over and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, there's a radio I built, and actually it was a transceiver for 20 meters that I had built from scratch, and I had it in a little plastic box, and I held it up and showed it to him, and rambled on in the way I do, and he raised his eyebrows and said, "Well, that's kind of neat." And then he reached in his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. It was a flip phone at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Flipped it open and says, "Here, you want to call somebody?" as if to say, I've got this cell phone. It works just fine. And then, but my stinger comment back to him was, "Yeah, but I can do it because I have a license, and because I earned that license. I know how the electrons flow in this circuit, and that's why I'm snapping my suspenders." And he just kind of looked away and said, "Well, have fun." I say, I am. So whatever turns your crank.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I'd like to thank you for joining me today on this interview. And we had a little bit of technical difficulty there in the middle, but that's what backups are for. Good lesson also for preparing.
Yeah, just like a SOTA adventure. You never know what you're going to find. Murphy's always there somewhere hiding.
Yes.
But Dennis, it's been my pleasure. And it's easy to get me to talk about my passion,
Yes.
passions, if you will. But you've been a great listener, and thank you for asking me. It's been a fun time.
Oh, thank you. It's, again, I actually was very excited and pleased when you said that you would do this interview, because a lot of people, again, they really come to admire your activation. I even have messages from people when I talk to some of my ham friends and I say, hey, I'm going to be interviewing Steve, WG0AT. They're like, oh, tell Steve I said hi. You know, you're really well known in the community. You continue to inspire us with your creations and sharing your posts. I hope that you continue to do so.
One little side note, one of the things that I've learned in video production, I had a mentor who, he said, it's all about the stories. We learn by storytelling, and that it's also all about, in that first 10 seconds, letting your viewer know what this video is going to be about, so that they don't go, now why am I watching this cat play the piano?
Yeah.
But he boiled it down to 3 words: entertain, educate, and inspire. And that was kind of the criteria I used for looking at my video when I finished it. Was, okay, the goats for the entertainment. Where's the education here? And that's when I realized that when you do a video, or maybe even a podcast about ham radio, you know, hams are basically nerds and hackers.
Yep.
And they're fascinated with, oh, that's how you did it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's an infed half wave, and there's a transformer. How many turns are in that transformer? That detail is important to get across and get out, and it creates interest, and it educates. The inspiring part of it is, it's kind of like the commercial for cereal where Mikey is just wolfing away his cereal, and older brothers get asked by their mom, well, what do you want? And they look over at Mikey and say, I'll have what Mikey's having. Because Mikey is having fun and enjoying.
Yep.
And if you can communicate the enjoyment factor, other people will go, yeah, I'll have what she's having or he's having.
Yes, definitely. Well, Steve, again, thank you very much. Wish you well in this cold weather.
Oh, you too, Dennis. Hey, what's with your fascination of batteries?
Oh, that. Well, I don't know. That's just something that I'm really, really into. I can't explain it myself. I really love building those batteries, and it's kind of my outlet. I like coming up with different ways of organizing all the components so that I can get it as compact as possible and as usable out in the field. One thing I haven't really seen too much is a smaller capacity battery that could power like a QRO rig, so higher amp draw. And so that was one of my own needs that I decided to build myself, because I couldn't find it really out in the field.
Exactly. Yeah, that was what drew me to goats, was hauling my lead acid batteries around.
Wow.
But yeah, finding batteries that can deliver the 30, 40 watts of power. The military, matter of fact, their minimum for a man pack is 20 watts. Of course, they're dealing with voice communication, and so power up 20 watts for reliable communications. You're talking a battery that weighs as much as a radio.
Yeah, totally. All right, I'm going to say 7-3, Steve, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, thank you, Dennis, and thanks for thinking of me and reaching out. It's been a blast.
Yes, it has. You've been listening to Hamdom Thoughts by 8060M. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you next time.